Hi, Matt. Sorry, are you ready for me to begin? Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. My name's Andy Hailey, and I'm going to be doing a talk on challenging traditional skill acquisition in particular, but also I'll cover things like role of the coach, using an alternative or more contemporary coaching methodology. You'll see plenty of overlaps, and you'll see plenty of things that have just had a face, but you might not necessarily know the name. You'll probably pick up on a lot of that as we go through the talk. Something that I've used to describe this and something that's come up in skill acquisition a lot is this phrase, old wine in a new bottle. With this approach, it's more about getting wine completely off the table and talking about whiskey. It is completely different. Okay. So a little bit about me. I've been the Aquatics director at Tanglin Trust for 5 years now. I was coaching before that at Tanglin. And sorry, this is written in like a third person context. I used it for another talk recently. I should be putting I, but you can kind of read this if you're interested at another time. So I'm hoping that these links work. And when these slides get shared, you'll be able to just click on some of the links that I've shared as well, and see some of the papers that have been written fairly recently. And this is sadly quite prolific in swimming, where you have pseudoscientific ideas kind of coming through that become fact, when actually when you pick them apart, you find that actually they're steeped in myth and tradition and handed down kind of coaching beliefs, usually from previous athletes. The way that they were coached becomes their coaching style. I just wanted to start, and whilst you read the little point on the side, this is one of my favorite videos that just kind of sums up a lot of what I believe in and where ecological dynamics kind of kicks in.
We don't have any sound.
No sound.
Damn it. Does anyone know how to get sound to play through?
Could you share sound?
Ah, here we go. Cool. So I'll rewind this. So obviously, if you don't know him already, this is Bruce Lee.
You see, actually, I do not teach, karate, because I do not believe in styles anymore. I mean, I do not believe that there is such thing as like Chinese way of fighting or the Japanese way of fighting or whatever way of fighting, because unless human beings have 3 arms and 4 legs, we will have a different form of fighting. But basically, we have only 2 hands and 2 feet. So styles tends to not only separate man, because they have their own doctrines, and then the doctrine became the gospel truth, that you cannot change, But if you do not have styles, if you just say, well, here I am, as a human being, how can I express myself totally and completely? Now, that way, you won't create a style, because style is a crystallization, I mean, that way, it's a process of continuing growth.
Cool. So yeah, I really like that that interview back in the 1960s with Bruce Lee, because he sums up what the definition of what style means in a skill acquisition kind of context. Because really, when you look at this in another sporting context like rugby, you hear about rugby coaches talking about the best form of practice for the defense is the attack, and the best form of defense is to train the attack. So they complement each other. So you get this thing called bidirectional influence on the environment and the performer. And this is really where ecological dynamics comes from. So ecological psychology and ecology is the interaction between organisms. In our context, we're talking about ecology in terms of the interaction between ourselves and the environment, or the athlete and the environment. The dynamical systems part, which comes on at the end, is the idea of nonlinear systems. So that being complex we're described as complex adaptive individuals or beings, we can't work in a linear way, or we can, but if we want to tap into that implicit learning, which James spoke about before, we need to be thinking in a non-linear sense of how people develop. So that's a great video. And the little question on the side here I put is gut feeling in coaching a problem. And I believe, no, it's not. I think as we go through this, just think what we're trying to do is link the empirical evidence that we have with the experiential knowledge, so our experiences, to kind of build this more evidence-based coaching model. And I put here, like, gut feeling, is it a problem? The only problem I have is a conversation I had with my dad when I was younger. As a confident teenager driving a car, I'd always say to him how good at driving I was. Dad, it's fine, I'm a good driver, there's not going to be any problems. And he would turn around to me and said, it's not you I'm worried about, it's the other drivers. It's the environment that I'm facing that is going to be presenting the challenges. So my gut feeling is I could be a coach, and I'm assured in my coaching model and the prescription that I give. But if I was to dig deep, how do I know that it's having the impact I need on all the swimmers that I coach? And sadly, what we see is this kind of pedestal of individual great athletes kind of justifying this process. And again, this is a little tangent which could go off onto another talk, and I think maybe even Cindy might touch on it later. But we have to sort of challenge our own beliefs and check where is the evidence for what we do and why we do it.
You see,
so this is quite a hectic schematic, but what it's doing is it's just showing the continuum of the teachings, the ways that you can approach skill. On one end, you've got that kind of direct teaching and the coach-led activities, trying to chunk things into blocks and linear processes. And on the other end, you've got discovery learning and explorative practice. And I'll say this straight away now, you can use both, which is why in ecological dynamics, everything's put on a continuum or a sliding scale. Or if you like to think about it, dials, where you can dial up or down along these kind of continuums. And I always like this one because it's got the picture of the diver up here. And you watch the divers, sometimes when you're at swimming meets, we have them here, and you watch the divers training. And I always watch, and they walk up to the end of the board and they do a couple of hops, and then they walk back and they go bounce, bounce, and walk back. What they don't do is they never complete the skill, which is to actually dive in the water. So I haven't got it on me, but there's a paper and a study in Australia where they found it's actually better for the athlete to bounce, mark their spot, and just carry on with the dive. Because when they're under pressure in the competition, even those little bounces, even if they get them wrong but can still try and execute a dive, is better than no dive at all. Which comes back again to what James was even alluding to about representative task design. So the practice has got to be representative of the outcome, but it doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is the focus. And you can see in here, like you can see the scrambledness of the different shapes, and that's just to illustrate the non-linear context that we're working in. And how children in particular, and ourselves, we don't work in a linear fashion too well. I mean, most of us in here, or a lot of us in here, are teachers based in a school, and sadly, you see a lot of the problems with learning come in when they start a curriculum-based education. Again, that could eat up a lot more time than we have for this talk. So this is where we kind of get led into the realms of skill adaptation. I deliberately used the word skill acquisition before because it's a name that's been given to this area. But actually, you don't acquire skill, it adapts. And any of you have got kids and you see them kind of growing up. I watched my son swimming the other day, and I went underwater and I watched him. And actually, the way he's swimming is just crawling. All he's doing is adapting to the fact he's now in water. But the movements he's making, the same as when you learn to crawl. So I think it's more about a term of skill adaptation as opposed to acquiring skill. And And how it works and how it differs to traditional skill acquisition in the form of schema building or information processing is we don't look at people, we don't look at the swimmers that we coach as processors, as computer systems that just need software updating. We're actually looking at them as organisms that interact with the world around them. And this is done through something called perception action coupling. Although it says information and movement, that's actually where the words perception action are. This is a clearer, simpler schematic. Just unfortunately, the words there I would have chosen differently. The way that someone perceives and takes action is all dependent on the constraints that are put on them. And you can see the three areas here: environmental, task, and individual constraints. So the way you behave is pretty much dictated by constraints. And I loved it when Taylor was talking about the problems of that we face in Singapore, of why we can't get the performance that we require. Well, this is what is something that they are researching more of, things called forms of life, which are historical, social, cultural constraints. So I do things based on the way my parents, my teachers, the way I was brought up, but that actually might have a negative effect on the way that I then perform or try to train. So that area is one of the areas within this approach that is requiring more research. But things that have been researched well have been the task and the environmental constraints. Sadly, I didn't have a chance to take a video, but if any of you have got kids, again, you can watch the way that they walk up to a door, a car door, I mean, and you just watch the way they open it. And generally, if they're quite small, they're little people like my lad, he'll go up to the wall and he'll be palmed up, and he'll put his fingers underneath the handle and pull. Whereas when we go to the door, my knuckles are down because my perception and my ability to take action is different to his. So the perception action coupling is different for me because of the way I perceive the world. And this delves into the philosophical element of this theory. Again, this could go on for a long time, but essentially with this approach is that the world, nothing exists in the world. So everyone's perception is different. The world around us isn't fixed. So every constraint that is placed, or every problem that is out there to be solved, could be solved a million different ways by everybody in every situation. So when we start to think about this for kids and their learning, we have to consider this in this kind of non-linear context, that actually we can't, or should I say the question, should our role be solution finders or problem designers? Are we, if we try to tackle every problem and handhold the athletes through the problems, are we enabling them to learn implicitly? Which, as James pointed out in the previous talk, is a very important part of learning. You know, learning without knowing you're learning is one of the strongest forms of learning, if not the strongest. So with this approach, this is where we're trying to tap into that implicit area of learning. And going into this can spiderweb into many different areas. We could be going into the biopsychosocial, as Taylor mentioned into the first talk, and we could be tapping into self-determination theory on another hand, and looking at the competencies and the autonomy that we can give the swimmers to carry out the tasks. So at this point, if you're thinking of any questions, I'm happy to pause and answer anything. But these are two good schematics on kind of what's happening with learning. If you look at the one on the left, and this is from the All Blacks, I mean, New Zealand's very ahead of the game in this type of research, especially from the University of Otago. And you can see the squiggly line there before the dip. And this is to show the actual chaos. And I mean, ecological dynamics comes from chaos theory. And you can see that kind of squiggly line. And this is the scatty, and sometimes as a coach, what you witness is that kind of horrific chaos, and kind of, to us, it seems as a problem. But from an ecological point of view, that's just the kids exploring. And they're going to get it wrong, and they learn through their mistakes. And you might even see a kind of a dip in performance after that initial learning. But what we're looking at is this kind of longer term retention of learning, which is the research is there to show that it's got a better transfer into skill, and not just into skill, but skill under pressure, which when we boil it down to it, that's where we want our athletes to be. They've got to be able to perform skills. They've got to be able to self-organize, be self-aware and self-regulate whilst under pressure. That's what we want at the end of the day. On the right-hand side, this is where we can start to push adaptability by creating an environment that causes adaptation through that level of uncertainty. When if you're too comfortable and you're too set in your ways, you become very stagnant. If you're kind of an Erickson theory kind of person, you might hit a plateau, or you might call it arrested development. But really, you just kind of fall into this secure state, which inhibits adaptation. So as coaches, we're kind of looking to get into that right-hand side box there. And one of the big ones about what I said, which relates to what I said before, with the constraints kind of approach, is the repetition without repetition. I want a representative task design that allows and affords my athlete to make decisions to overcome a problem. And that could be different every time they try the task. But then you question, why shouldn't it be? Because every day, every rep, every set, every session, every week, every month is different for an athlete. You know, a girl might be halfway through a menstrual cycle. She might be during her period. Your swimmer could be fatigued. They could be injured. They could have had exams all day and they're stressed. So to try and have a model in our mind that's prescriptive on skill isn't really fair to them. And what we want to try and allow them is to keep the design that they are pushed, but within a safe environment. The guy I work with, Dr. Richard Shuttleworth, he gave me a great example about this in Australian football. If, as an athlete, you're taking the kicks for goal and you miss, and they used to call it a dumb mistake, to put it politely. And if you did a dumb mistake, you were kind of told to go and get changed that day. And you think, God, you know, this is uncertainty, and we could be going into unsafe here. So that is the role of the coach, is to step in and make sure that's safe. You know, you take them to one side. Okay, you know, what made you miss? Okay, what can we do better on the next one? Where's, you know, and that's where you step in and you give the support. So keeping that uncertainty is important, and it's our jobs to keep it in the safe realm. But there's no problem with it dipping into the unsafe once in a while. As long as you're aware of it, you can keep it under control. And it's even not bad to go into the left-hand side box to consolidate. You know, if we're approaching a meet, you might want them to get stable. But before the race or something, you might want to create a little bit of instability to kind of sharpen something up. Any questions at this point?
Loads and loads of questions, but we will.
Okay. This is just a good example of the perception action coupling. Have a look at this novice, and have a look at Ronaldo during this little test. Now, this video does go on for 6 minutes, so I won't play it all, otherwise I'm just wasting time, but it's on YouTube. Check this out.
So Ronaldo's vast experience gives him the ability to intuitively read the game under normal conditions. But what if the conditions are very far from normal? Can Ronaldo still hit the back of the net if all the lights are turned off and he's in complete darkness?
Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to have Andy feeding the balls in as if it's a cross, and then sometime in the ball flight, the lights are going to go black, so you won't be able to see anything at all. We're expecting you to be able to put the ball in the goal. That's what we're hoping will happen. We're hoping that you'll have picked up some advanced cues from Andy's body position, the shapes, the positioning of his feet and his hips, and therefore we'll be able to tell exactly where the ball's going to go and get yourself in the right position, even though you can't see it.
Okay. Taking Ronaldo on in this seemingly impossible test is an amateur footballer called Ronald.
Come and join me, Ronald. Ronaldo. So we've got Ronald in here, same age as you, roughly the same height. We're going to use Ronald as a comparison and see how he reacts doing this same test.
Ronald is going first.
Dark! Light! Light!
So what does the night vision reveal? Ronald misses the ball by quite a way. Perhaps not that surprising.
What I do is I might just talk over this just to save time. So,
But can
what you just
Ronaldo
see,
do
obviously,
any
is him
better?
missing the ball. And you think,
I hope
where's
to do
what is
once.
he looking at? He's probably trying to read the ball through the flight. Whereas when you watch Ronaldo, he has a different
Dark!
strategy.
Light!
Hey, that's one straight in the bag.
The night vision replay shows how differently Ronaldo performs.
So when we think of that from a coaching angle, you know, we have to think, what is Ronaldo picking up that he's able to see the ball that he can't actually see? So you can get more from the video, but what's happening is he's perceiving what the body position and the strike of the crosser, and he's able to couple with that allows him to interpret the position of the ball. And this is slightly different to maybe an information processing point of view, which would mean that he would predict where the ball would be based on data that's being stored in his processing. So you can start to appreciate whether the two differ. Now, an information processing way would be, right, we're going to kick that ball, we're going to repeat it. Ronaldo, you're going to stand in that spot, you're going to kick the ball in the same way, or even get a machine to do it, and we're going to ram this until it becomes perfection. Whereas, you know, in a game context, the type of cross that you're faced with changes every time the passer kicks the ball. And we can see this in swimming. You know, as I've said, you've got the physical changes, the bio part of the swimmers, and you've got the psychological. And you've also got the environmental constraints. Matt, when we were at Rumrudi for CSAC, was it 2019? Our swimmers had a real problem turning because of the curve on the bottom of the pool as you approach the wall. And I've asked swimmers at all levels, I said, what do you actually look at when you do a tumble turn? And not one person answered the T. And I think when I think back to when I was swimming, how many times did I ever really count my strokes on the T? I mean, you guys can think about it. Put your hand up if you disagree. But most of the athletes use a peripheral sense of where they are in the lane. And they use where the wall meets the floor, which is why swimmers who race at pools that have a bulkhead get a little bit thrown when the markings on the pool kind of change. You can't actually see the bulkhead where the bulkhead meets the floor. So we can start to see where these environments kind of change. Here's just a couple of clips from my pool. Just have a look at the two videos. Have a think how you might have coached what you're seeing. So this was taken first. I'll give you a context. The girls were just told to swim as fast as they can for 25 meters breaststroke. Okay, generally, I think best to look at the two girls. You can see clearer, the silver hat and the black hat here. They're actually both twins. Okay, let's have a look at any changes and keep an eye out for changes that happen through the swim. Now, the goal here was to swim as fast as you can still. Okay. Sorry, guys, I can't see the chat because the way I've got the screen set up. So if you want to just speak up and say what do you think I've done from a coach, if you're on deck, what do you think I've delivered to the swimmers to get them to make those changes, if you see any changes at all, that is. Don't leave me hanging. I can't see the chat. I can't see the chat box. If you've got any yarn that's being anonymous, I can't see. So in a traditional context, I could probably say, if I was coming at this without having done the videoing myself, I probably told the girls here to hold a glide time. That's not actually what happened. The task I gave the girls for the second 25 was to swim as fast as you can using as few strokes as possible. But yet the outcome was the girls held a longer glide time, which I could have very easily have done in a linear way. To cut to the chase, I could have just told them, which, as James said in the last talk, we would have been down the explicit end. And what that means is I could get an immediate performance outcome. The challenge would be, would that happen under pressure? And this is where the literature suggests that actually under pressure on the race day, this is where kids fall short and athletes fall short. So what's happening? You can see the girl in the silver hat, she's holding a longer stroke. Her hips are higher, her head's slightly lower. And in my mind, I'm looking at that with the model that I have, which we all have different models. I'm thinking that looks better. And she was actually swimming faster. The main point is that she's able to swim faster with fewer strokes. So this is where a constraints-led approach is starting to allow for affordances. So the girls knew the pressure was getting to the end and meeting the same time. That's where the uncertainty kind of kicked in. The goal from my point was the task was, well, you've got to try and reduce the number of strokes you take. You can't do more strokes than what you did on the first one, but you've got to still hit that time. So you can see with that uncertainty trying to lead, what it does is it pushes them into this adaptation using the environment, which is the water, to hold a longer streamline. And also you can see it's the faster recovery of the arms. I mean, these are all good tick points that we would have for swimming breaststroke. I've also put another link for a useful paper here as well.
Sorry, Annie, just a quick question.
Yep.
So going back to that. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're just trying to put them under a little bit of uncertainty, making them feel it first of what it shouldn't be feeling like, and then giving it to them so they can actually feel the difference, and then that sticks with them more.
Yeah. In an ecological kind of viewpoint, you can't know what yes means without knowing what no means. And you can't know what no means without knowing what yes is. Okay. So if you have, I've seen it with swimmers with the tempo trainers, and they will do, they reduce the number of beeps every 25. So beep, beep. And what we found was the kids who were actually getting slower were holding longer glides, and they were whizzing ahead. And you had some kids who were stopping their hands by their chest. And this is where you've got to be tempted, and as your role is not to intervene just yet, allow them to make those mistakes. Because what started to happen was they felt that drag, that frontal resistance of pausing their hands by their chest. And they were like, well, hang on a minute, if I just push my hands forward faster and hold a glide, now I'm catching up. So you're allowing that opportunity, and you're allowing them to find their way, which is coming onto the next slide. What you want to create is an environment that encourages them to search and discover or explore. It's a term called wayfinding through self-organization and self-regulation. So those girls in the breaststroke were self-organizing and self-regulating their stroke to overcome the problem. And what they call it like wayfinding. So rather than having pathways to something or even a style to somewhere, you've got a whole landscape in front of you, which you can take as many avenues or different ones as you want. You might hit a fence, you might hit a roadblock, you just keep finding your way. And that's what this allows athletes to do. And this is where you get these kind of, your role as the coach now is more of in this approach, using this framework, is more of a facilitator or a designer, an environment landscape designer, as opposed to a solution finder, which, and the studies that have come from this, of coaches have actually found that they feel that they're in a state of being absent from the process, which makes them feel very, very nervous. So you do need a lot of support, especially from maybe like ADs and teachers and coaches around you to really go through with this. Thankfully, I am in the school I'm at, and I'm really lucky to work with Rick on this. And what you find is through this exploration, you get to a position of being able to exploit. How can I exploit what I have just discovered to give me the edge? And it's quite a hectic little schematic, but if you kind of look at it, it does start to make sense of where the coach steps in. But don't be in this position where you feel like you're absent from the process just because you're not giving instructions. And don't get me wrong, you can still interject. You know, if you've got a kid or you're someone in the final, or you say the Olympic final, and you've seen something as the coach that could give them that edge just before they dive off the blocks, well, don't wait for them to have a go straight. I'll just tell them straight away. So this is what I mean, the sliding scale. And nothing is, it's a false dichotomy to think that things are this or that. Work along a sliding scale.
Andy, can I just say, I think that's a really good point. I'm loving your talk, by the way. I think it's brilliant. I think that's the hard part. Is quite a few years ago, I tried doing something quite similar, and initially, there's a percent, like I started off like a real madness coach, like screaming and shouting up and down, and I mean I still do a lot of that, but the standing back is really hard if that's the way that that motivational climate way, you know, that I was kind of wired in to sell programs to kids. That actually stepping back and just allowing it, and knowing then when to jump in. I think that's a really important thing, because the issue, I guess, that I'm not arguing it, because what you're saying is great stuff. I think the issue is you can go the other way, and you can have a coach who's like, oh yeah, you know, I'm going to let discovery learning happen, and they discover so wrong, because the feedback isn't as simple as you feel, that your hands are maybe getting a bit of drag. Some just won't feel that. I mean, you just think about your mum and dad swimming in the condo pool or whatever. Like, how come my dad's still pooling like this? Like, oh my God, how much swimming have you watched, Dad, over the years? Like, he's not feeling it, right? Whereas football, for example, that feedback, okay, Ronaldo doesn't see the goal, but that feedback is immediate. You know, you wrap your foot too far around the ball and it goes to the left. The next time you wrap it around less. And that feedback's so instant. That is a challenge, I think, from a swimming point of view. But I mean, I totally agree. I think it's at the right level with the right kids, sticking the stopwatches in the pocket, stepping back, just looking like you're chilling, but just stressing inside about everything. It's quite hard to do. But
I think a lot of things can be, let's say the example you gave with the breaststroker, they're not quite getting it. Well, that's where you change the design, you change the constraint. But again, like you said, you shouldn't always be absent in terms of giving instruction. That's not, again, ecological dynamics, it's called an approach, and you have the constraints-led approach, but it's actually anything but an approach. It's not a style. As soon as it becomes a way, or as Bruce Lee kindly said at the beginning, you know, it becomes a doctrine. And then you can't move, you can't shift. Whereas actually as coaches, we know it's very nuanced. We need to shift. One athlete might need more and one athlete might need less. So we need that kind of relationship with the athletes to get that, and to know, okay, they need to be screamed at, but I'm screaming at them with the objective of getting the outcome that we're aiming for, not necessarily finding solutions for them, but I need to motivate them. And it's interesting from the motivational side of things, with the implicit learning where this taps into, and more research coming out now about nonlinear pedagogy and constraints supporting self-determination theory, which if you, again, that could be another talk on its own, where you're supporting the relatedness, the autonomy and competency of someone. You're more likely to want to be at a training session and do the task set if you want to do it.
Yeah.
If you're
psychological need, right?
Yeah. So this is, again, comes back to what Taylor, you said at the beginning with the biopsychosocial. So through this, the big challenge I had with this was, okay, well, what about volume? Periodization, all these kind of traditional ways of coaching. I'm like, well, hang it, but they still need to get this volume in. They still need to train energy systems. The thing is that volume is just another constraint that you can use. You know, and I spoke to a great guy in America called Andrew Sheaf, who's at Virginia. And he's at the performance end of probably where I am. So, and he's ahead of the game with this with me. And I said, well, how do you plan the season then? And one of the big ones as well, if you really look at it, you want to train the skills, the fast skills, short and fast. The longer skills, okay, you want to practice them slower but longer. And as you go through the season, the slower skills get faster, and the shorter skills sessions get longer. And actually, if you plot that, it starts to look damn like periodization or in the volume intensity kind of model. But the difference is that the focus is on the skills as opposed to just the volume. And we start to move away from this kind of dependency on energy systems. I mean, even as Taylor will know as well, because we've both done the same course actually. We both had a mentor, a great guy called Andy Kirkland, he said to me in a personal chat was, well, periodization is really just athlete management, because how many actually do it? It's a way for me to put an athlete in a box and keep them nice and tidy and keep them there, so that they do the things that I prescribe to them, so they can't deviate and they can't go wrong. But this is where, like, going back to my first slide is, well, how do we know that that box you put them in is the right box for them? And this is where the big question about coaching, and this is where it's challenged me as well. And again, like I said, I've been very lucky to work with a great guy in this area, and through my masters to explore this a lot. And it really is fascinating and eye-opening. And I'd only encourage people to try it out, make mistakes, explore. This approach applies to the coach just as much as it applies to the athletes that you handle. If you're unwilling to explore as a coach, I don't know, fear of being sacked because you're doing something outside the box, you've got to question the environment you work in. But if you're allowed to explore, just like the kids are, you can get some real gains from what you do. This is actually the last slide. Like I said, it's like a continuum kind of effect, this kind of dialing up and down. The last slide is literally just some of the references that I've put in. If any of you are interested, you can go away and have a look. I've actually spoken about a couple more, but yeah, they're not on there. And that's me done. If anyone's got any more questions, I'm happy to answer now, or you can drop me an email. I can send, or maybe I'll pop it in the chat later, or give it to Matt to send out after.
I think this is one of the best chats talks that I've listened to. Really interesting how some of the stuff that we've been doing the last six months or so, since Jake has been on board, he's sort of really into trying out new things and so on. And a lot of this he's kind of touched on, and I think before Taylor's touched on it, but I don't think it really hit home with me. And so seeing this and then pairing it up with what we're doing with our program, it's really good to see this as well, and I find it very interesting. So thank you for this. I would love to have some of these slides again and go through it again.
Bad leadership, I think, AJ. Sorry, mate.
All these slides will go out through Matt. Sadly, within the short time frame, there's so much more to this than what I've tried to give a bit of a crash course and a summary with some of the key points. Like I said, you could go, there's a lot of tangents, and the way it works is actually it grows. I've seen online of podcasts, and I've seen chats on Twitter where you've got the information processing camp laying it thick on the ecological guys, and all they do is, okay, that's a good point. Well, it just becomes part of the ecological process. So there is no kind of this or that or conflict. It's just, and a lot of the old skill acquisition stuff still covers and complements. It wasn't like guys went out there to kind of disprove something. It's just they found a form of a better way to teach skill. And when we talk about skill, I think it's important to define what skill is in comparison to technique, because swim coaches talk about technique and skill in the same bubble. A skill is the completion of the whole thing, but you might use different techniques within that to problem solve to achieve that skill. So when we talk about ideal technique, we have to question, what are we actually talking about here? What is the perfect technique? If a kid, think of some of the great swimmers over the years. Okay, Popov, we could say had a perfect technique. A lot of us might agree, some of us might not. So did he or didn't he? I've looked at, I remember the kids talking about Chad Leclerc, and he breathes every stroke on the butterfly. But yet personally, this is years ago now, I taught to breathe every other stroke. So when you compare some of the greats, they have very different styles based on their shapes, their sizes, their upbringing, how they're trained, what pools they're in. I noticed that a lot of my kids, they learn they're underwater more on their side because we train in a double shallow end pool. So to get that same weight on their feet, both directions, they tend to push off and kick more on their side than they do on their front or back when they push off the way out the turn. because they feel this is the feedback the athletes, and this is one of the crucial areas of this, is to get that feedback on how the athlete feels, rather than you think, okay, well, you need to do this, is so important, because actually what they're telling you is gold in terms of feedback. So I could really keep going. Matt, how? Stop me if you need, because I don't want to overlap on someone else's talk.
We've got about 4 more minutes until Angelo takes over in this room. So any more questions, by all means, keep on going. I love kind of the through lines. This is, you know, our 4th talk today. And there's so many connections between all of them already. And I think that's just fascinating. And there's so much more to learn here. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Just a big sigh. This will link quite nicely, I think, with what Cindy's got prepared later, because with this approach and how it works, and when we start to tap into self-determination theory and like motivational climates and the biopsychosocial, using an ecological kind of view on things, we can, and this is a belief that we can start to support, and there's the research there that suggests it and shows it, that we can support athletes along their journeys better. If we can do that, we can start to limit dropout rates. You know, if we show you kind of and tap into this implicit and this self-determined drive people have, can we stop the big dropout rates that we see in swimming?
I would definitely say, and I'm again, don't get me wrong, I'm totally behind you. My thesis was pretty much on that whole thing, but I think the difference we do have as well, which there does have to be, we can't give too much too early, because there's still an element of, they need to, like you said about feeling safe, the kids in these schools need to have that structure first for quite a long time, probably longer than a kid in a club would, because they'll discover something else, you know, like, and they're not actually, when you really look at it, like the younger ones down, they're not having those needs fulfilled, and so what happens is they don't feel competent enough because they don't do enough, or you know, or it doesn't feel related enough, you know, and that's where, like, I guess what Cindy was going to say, and so you can have as much autonomy as you want, and I think this is the danger. You can give loads of autonomy, but if you don't have the competence or you don't feel related to what you're doing, it's irrelevant. You know, you have to build all 3 in terms of a self-determination theory point of view, right? And I feel that that's what I've learned here, is that comes way later than it ever did in club swimming. I feel I have to give them so much that you would never have to give elsewhere, to keep them in it, to keep them coming back. And then there gets to that point where you realize, okay, now we're there. And at that point, sometimes you think, like, they could have done with this at a younger age, but you know they're going to get pulled somewhere else. They're going to get pulled.
When it always comes to autonomy, you have to question, is it ours to give in the first place?
No, absolutely.
So, you know, so through this approach, you know, the kids are discovering themselves, just like I've watched my young lad growing up. You know, he doesn't even understand the words I say most of the time. There is no directive. He has autonomy because he was born with it. We're all born with it. And he decides what he wants, and he finds a way. Whether I put a chair in front of him, he'll climb over it. If I stand there and try to block him, he'll go underneath my legs. You know, so they find ways, and he's driven to do it. And when he finds it, when he gets around me, he's dead excited because he's there and he's got whatever he's trying to grab, a plug socket or glass, or, you know, something dangerous probably. You know, so it's right there from early on.
What you're saying there is exactly right, and I guess that's the same kind of thing that I'm saying. By standing in front of him, by putting that, you're scaffolding that learning for him, and I think that scaffolding has to be, you know, double strength. You know, bamboo is not enough. You know, we have to scaffold it harder here, and I think that once you get that, then the base is there, and yeah, completely. Yes.
Oh, I've just seen the chat box because my presentation has gone down. I think, Matt, are we ready for the next?
We
The
are.
last time I did this talk, it went on for 2.5 hours.
And I'm sure it could have here too. And I appreciate you cutting it down for our time constraints, but there's so much more there. And
there you go,
definitely we'll share those resources out, and a lot to dig in there.
That's an example in itself. The time constraint I had forced me to be succinct with the information I gave out. There you go.